It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the small, quiet town of Ridgewood. Sarah, a 35-year-old stay-at-home mom, had just finished her weekly grocery run and was making her way to the local park to pick up her son, Tommy. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting a warm, golden hue over the quiet streets. Ridgewood was the kind of town where people knew each other by name, where everyone seemed to go about their business in peace, and where the idea of trouble felt far away. Sarah's life, like so many others, revolved around routine. The hustle of taking care of her family, making sure her husband, Michael, had dinner ready when he got home, and organizing Tommy's extracurriculars had kept her busy. Despite the sometimes overwhelming responsibility, she loved her life and cherished the stability that came with it. Her husband, Michael, was a respected police captain in town. They had been together for over 15 years, building their family and their reputation in the community. They weren't rich, but they had enough to live comfortably. Their son, Tommy, was a bright, energetic 10-year-old who loved reading and playing soccer. He had a strong sense of fairness, something Sarah and Michael had worked hard to instill in him. On this particular day, Sarah had planned a quick stop to the park to pick up Tommy after his playdate with his best friend, Ethan. She couldn't wait to get home and start preparing dinner before Michael came in from his shift at the police station. She was used to this quiet, predictable life, but as she pulled into the park's parking lot, something felt off. The first thing she noticed was the loud voices, the rowdy laughter that didn't fit with the usual calm of the park. Two men were standing near the playground, their words slurred and their movements unsteady. Sarah's instincts immediately told her something was wrong, but she didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they were just having a rough day, she thought. After all, it wasn't unheard of for people to get a little too loud in public. But then, as she got closer, Sarah realized these weren't just any men, they were off-duty police officers. Their uniforms, though slightly disheveled, gave them away. She could tell they had been drinking, their faces flushed, their speech slurring. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She knew these men by reputation. They were known around town, but not necessarily for good reasons. One of them was Officer Rick Pierce, a loudmouth with a tendency to start trouble. The other, his partner, was Officer Gary Thomas, a quieter man who seemed to go along with whatever Rick said. As Sarah approached the swings, where Tommy was waiting for her, Rick let out a loud laugh and nudged Gary. "Hey, kid!" Rick called out, his voice booming across the playground. "Your mom must be real proud of you, huh?" Tommy, who had always been a confident child, looked up at the two men with a confused expression. He knew they were cops, but he didn't understand why they were acting this way. Sarah's stomach tightened, her protective instincts kicking in. She didn't know why, but something about the way they were eyeing Tommy and laughing sent a chill down her spine. She quickly walked over, giving them a polite but firm look. "Is there a problem, officers?" she asked, trying to keep her tone steady despite the growing unease in her chest. Rick grinned, his eyes glazed over. "Just asking your kid what he's doing out here," he said with a mocking chuckle. "He looked like he's up to no good." Sarah felt a surge of anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. "He's fine. We were just about to head home," she replied, her voice cool but with a hint of authority that made Rick pause. "Maybe you should get some rest. You're clearly not in any condition to be here." The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them, and immediately she could feel the tension shift. Rick's grin faltered, and Gary, the quieter officer, shifted uncomfortably. But Rick wasn't one to back down, especially not when someone called him out. He stepped closer, his voice lowering in a menacing tone. "Watch your tone, lady. You're gonna regret talking to us like that." Sarah felt her heart race. She knew it was a mistake to escalate the situation, but she couldn't stand by and let them bully her son. "You're drunk," she said firmly. "You have no business being here, and you certainly have no right to threaten my child." The air was thick with tension as Rick took a step closer, his breath heavy with alcohol. He looked around, as if assessing whether anyone was watching. Tommy stood beside his mother, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. Sarah's protective instincts flared. She stepped in front of Tommy, trying to shield him from the officers. "What's the problem, lady? You think you're better than us?" Rick sneered. He looked at Gary for support, but Gary, perhaps sensing the escalating danger, seemed hesitant. "I think you need to leave," Sarah said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "You're not fit to be here." Rick scoffed, his face turning red with rage. "You really want to do this? You think you're untouchable just because your husband's some big-shot cop?" His words were slurred, but there was a dangerous edge to them now. Before Sarah could respond, Rick grabbed Tommy roughly by the arm, pulling him away from her. "Let go of my son!" Sarah shouted, her voice breaking as panic surged in her chest. She reached for Tommy, but Rick shoved her away with one hand, his grip on Tommy tightening. Gary looked at the scene, his hesitation now replaced by an unsettling silence. Sarah's mind raced, this was going too far. But what could she do? She was just a mother, standing alone against two men with power. She didn't want to escalate things further, but Rick was too far gone. The situation spiraled out of control in a matter of seconds. Sarah's mind raced, her thoughts fragmented by the shock and the overwhelming fear for her son. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat like a drum in her ears. It was as if the world had frozen in time, and the only thing that mattered was Tommy's safety. The sting of the alcohol on his clothes seemed to burn even deeper, a symbol of their humiliation, but it wasn't just about the alcohol, it was about what the officers were doing to them, to their family. The act was cruel, unnecessary, and felt like a personal assault on everything Sarah had worked to protect. Tommy stood there, stunned, looking down at the wet spot on his shirt, his eyes wide with confusion and a dawning sense of injustice. "Let him go!" Sarah screamed again, her voice growing louder, more desperate. Her body moved instinctively, trying to break free of the tight grip Rick had on Tommy. But the officer didn't flinch. In fact, he seemed to revel in the power he held over her and her child, his smirk widening as if enjoying the spectacle. For a brief moment, Sarah considered her options. Could she fight back? Could she get Tommy away from him? She knew deep down that any physical confrontation would only make things worse, but the injustice of it all fueled a fire in her chest that she couldn't ignore. Every fiber of her being screamed to protect her son, to make this nightmare stop. "Don't you dare touch him again!" Sarah demanded, her voice shaky but filled with a defiant edge. Rick leaned in closer, his breath smelling of alcohol and cigarettes. "What are you gonna do about it?" he sneered, his hand tightening on Tommy's arm. His words were meant to belittle, to strip Sarah of her power and dignity. But what he didn't understand was that by pushing her, by attacking her child in this way, he was creating a force far stronger than any weapon or badge. Sarah's mind snapped into focus. In that moment, she wasn't just a mother, she was a lioness, ready to protect her cub at any cost. Tommy, still in Rick's grasp, looked up at his mother, his face a mix of confusion and fear. His small voice broke through the tension, weak and trembling. "Mom, what's happening? Why are they doing this?" The words hit Sarah like a blow to the chest. The innocence in Tommy's eyes, the trust he had always placed in the world around him, was being shattered right before her eyes. How could she explain this to him? How could she protect him from the ugliness of this moment? She didn't have time to think about it. The only thing that mattered was getting him away from these men, away from the danger that loomed over them like a dark cloud. In a split second, Sarah made her decision. She pushed against Rick's chest with all her strength, her hands shoving him back as she reached for Tommy. "Let go of my son," she screamed, her voice laced with fear and fury. She barely registered the force with which Rick stumbled backward, but she didn't care. All that mattered was getting Tommy away from him. For a brief moment, it seemed like the world had held its breath. Rick, momentarily stunned by the shove, loosened his grip on Tommy just enough for Sarah to grab her son's arm and pull him toward her. She held him tightly against her side, her hands trembling as she whispered urgently to him, "It's okay, honey. We're going to get out of here. Just stay close to me." But Rick wasn't done. His eyes narrowed, his face reddened with rage as he regained his balance and stepped forward again, this time in a full attempt to intimidate. He reached out, grabbing Sarah by the wrist, squeezing so hard she winced. "You think you can just walk away from this? You've got a big mouth for someone who's about to be arrested," Rick growled. His words dripped with disdain, his anger now a visible, palpable force. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The situation was escalating faster than she could keep up with. She could feel her pulse racing in her neck, the blood rushing to her head. Everything within her screamed for action. She had to get away, had to protect Tommy, but how? She could feel the helplessness creeping in, and it terrified her. Suddenly, she heard a familiar voice cutting through the chaos. "What the hell is going on here?" Michael's voice was sharp, commanding. Sarah turned, her heart lifting with relief. There, standing at the edge of the park, was her husband, Detective Michael Carter. His strong frame was silhouetted against the setting sun, his uniform neatly pressed, his badge gleaming in the fading light. He wasn't just her husband in that moment, he was the law, and he was here to save them. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she saw the look of shock and disbelief on Michael's face. He knew the officers. Rick Pierce and Gary Thomas were both men who had worked with him at the police station before. Michael had seen their flaws, their tendency to bend the rules when they thought no one was watching. But this? This was something else entirely. Rick, still holding onto Sarah's wrist, froze when he saw Michael. For a moment, there was a tense silence, as if the air had thickened with the weight of the situation. Gary, who had been standing off to the side, looked around nervously, unsure of how to handle the arrival of his superior officer. "Michael, get them off me," Sarah pleaded, her voice breaking as the full impact of the situation hit her. Her hands shook as she held Tommy, the boy still confused and trembling, now clinging to her like a lifeline. Michael's expression hardened. He was no longer just the concerned husband, he was the police captain. His eyes flicked between the two officers, his jaw tightening. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice low but filled with authority. "Let her go. Let my son go." Rick's bravado faltered. He had known Michael for years, had worked alongside him, and even though they were off duty, even though he was intoxicated, there was something about Michael's presence that made him hesitate. The badge, the years of respect, Michael's reputation was powerful. Gary shifted uncomfortably but didn't say anything, unsure of how to intervene. Rick, however, wasn't backing down that easily. He released Sarah's wrist but didn't step away. Instead, he sneered. "What, now you're gonna play the big cop? You think you're better than us just because of that badge?" Michael took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "I don't think." "I know," he said, his voice colder than Sarah had ever heard it. He wasn't just angry now, he was furious, and the shift was clear in his posture. The power dynamic had changed. Rick's drunken grin faltered as he realized the depth of his mistake. He had underestimated Michael. He had underestimated the fact that Michael wouldn't let this slide, not with his family involved. "Do you know who I am?" Michael's voice was steely now, each word cutting through the tension like a blade. "I am your superior officer. And I'm placing you under arrest for assault. You will answer for this." In that moment, the tables had turned. What started as an unsettling encounter at the park had exploded into something far larger, and the repercussions were about to be felt by everyone involved. The course of Sarah and Michael's life was about to change forever. The shock of Michael's words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Sarah couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. The police officers who had so casually humiliated her and Tommy were now facing the wrath of her husband, the man she had spent years building a life with. The very thought that Michael was about to arrest Rick and Gary made her stomach twist with a mix of disbelief and fear. Her mind raced, spinning in every direction. Could this really be happening? Was it possible that two officers, men who had once been allies, could fall so far, so quickly? The reality of the situation was only starting to sink in. Michael had always been a man of principle, of duty, and this was a line that couldn't be crossed. Rick's face was flushed with anger, but underneath it, Sarah could see the flicker of fear. He knew he had overstepped. He had known Michael for years, and even in his drunken haze, he recognized the gravity of the situation. The badge Michael wore wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was a symbol of respect. And in this moment, that respect wasn't just the foundation of Michael's power, it was the very thing that made Rick's actions unforgivable. Gary, standing silently to the side, glanced between the two men. His eyes were wide, but his expression was one of unease rather than defiance. He hadn't been the instigator of this altercation, he was simply caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But that wouldn't save him. He had allowed this to happen, had stood idly by while Rick crossed a line that no one, least of all a fellow officer, should have. Michael, Rick slurred, his voice dripping with arrogance and now tinged with a hint of desperation. You don't know what you're talking about. It's just a little joke. It's not that serious. Just let it go. Michael's jaw tightened. A joke, he repeated, stepping closer, his presence commanding the space between them. You think this is funny? You think it's funny to humiliate a child? To pour alcohol on a 10-year-old's shirt for no reason? That's not just a joke, Rick. That's abuse. And I don't care who you are, I'm not letting this slide. The words cut through the tension like a knife. Rick was speechless for a moment, the weight of his actions finally crashing down on him. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anyone to stand up to him, least of all Michael, the officer he had once worked beside. He had assumed that his badge, his position, would protect him from the consequences of his behavior. But now, it was clear that he had miscalculated. Sarah held her breath, watching as Michael's anger burned through the shock and disbelief. She could see the inner turmoil in his eyes, the conflict of being forced to make a decision between his loyalty to his fellow officers and his duty as a father and husband. It was a choice no one should have to make, but in this moment, it wasn't just a decision, it was a call for justice, one that would ripple through the entire town of Ridgewood. Rick's arrogance began to dissolve, replaced by an ugly mixture of guilt and fear. You can't be serious, he muttered, almost pleading. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean any of this. His words came out slurred, but there was no mistaking the shift in his demeanor. He had lost control. And now, he was trying to salvage whatever he could, to salvage his career, his reputation. Michael didn't flinch. You don't get to decide what's serious and what's not. This is serious, Rick. And you're not walking away from it. Sarah's heart beat louder in her chest. She was grateful for Michael's strength, for his unwavering commitment to doing what was right, but she could also feel the weight of the consequences bearing down on them. This was not a simple matter. Her family's life, their reputation, everything was about to change. The power dynamics in their town, the trust in the police department, everything was at risk. But the conversation wasn't over. There was a shift in the air, a tension that thickened again as Gary finally spoke up. His voice was quieter, but the uncertainty in his tone was unmistakable. Michael, man, look, this wasn't supposed to go like this, he said, his eyes darting nervously between Rick and Michael. We were just messing around. We didn't mean to cause a scene. Michael's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing through Gary's words. It doesn't matter what you meant. You were complicit. You stood by while this happened, and you didn't do anything to stop it. That makes you just as responsible. Gary swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping. He wasn't the mastermind here, but in Michael's eyes, he had failed to intervene. And now, both men would pay the price for their actions. As the moments passed, the gravity of the situation settled over Sarah like a heavy fog. She could feel the eyes of the park's few remaining visitors on them. People had stopped in their tracks, murmuring in disbelief. Word was already spreading. The incident was unfolding in front of a small but growing audience, and soon, it would be the talk of the entire town. The police department, her husband's colleagues, the residents of Ridgewood, all of them would soon know what had happened. Michael's reputation, their family's reputation, would be forever linked to this moment. There was no going back. Rick, now realizing the full scope of his mistake, tried once more to salvage his position. "You don't have to do this, Michael," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "We've been through a lot together. You can't let this ruin everything." But Michael's resolve only hardened. "You've ruined it yourself," he replied coldly. "You made this choice. And now you'll deal with the consequences." Sarah stepped forward, her hand still clutching Tommy's, her heart aching as she looked at her son. He was still processing the chaos, the confusion of what had just unfolded. He had never seen his parents fight like this, had never witnessed the raw power of the law being wielded against someone who was supposed to be upholding it. Her mind flashed to the first day she had met Michael, his calm demeanor, his quiet strength. He had always been someone she could count on, someone who took pride in the work he did, in the responsibility that came with wearing the badge. And now, as her husband stood before two officers who had crossed the line, she saw the full weight of the man she had married. He wasn't just a cop, he was a protector, a father, a husband. And he was about to bring justice to a situation that had shattered their lives in an instant. "Michael," Sarah said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of everything that had happened. "Are you sure about this? This will change everything." Michael looked at her, his expression softening just for a moment. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch reassuring, grounding her in the storm of emotions swirling around them. "I have to do this, Sarah," he said, his voice steady, despite the chaos. "It's the right thing to do. For you. For Tommy. For everyone who believes in justice." And with that, the decision was final. The community of Ridgewood, the very people who had trusted the police to keep them safe, would soon see that no one, no matter their rank or position, was above the law. The ripple effects of this moment would be felt far beyond the park that day. The transformation was only just beginning. As the sirens wailed in the distance, signaling the arrival of backup, Michael's grip on the situation tightened. The air was thick with tension as Sarah stood beside him, her hand still firmly clutching Tommy's, her mind racing. She had never imagined that their quiet evening at the park, a simple outing with her son, would turn into something so momentous, so life-altering. The arrival of backup was a necessary formality, but to Sarah, it felt like a reminder of just how far this situation had escalated. Michael had been unwavering in his decision, but the truth was sinking in, this wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the whole town, about the very fabric of the police department, about how power and authority could be abused without anyone being held accountable. And now, it was Michael's responsibility to make sure that didn't happen. The crowd that had gathered around them, initially murmuring in disbelief, had started to disperse. Some whispered amongst themselves, unsure of what they had witnessed, while others couldn't take their eyes off the unfolding scene. Sarah could feel their gazes, the weight of the community's scrutiny pressing on her. This wasn't just about her family anymore, it was about what people would believe when they heard the story, what they would take away from it. Would they see Michael as the hero, as the man who stood up for what was right? Or would they see him as a man torn between loyalty and duty, caught in a conflict too complicated to resolve without tearing everything apart? Rick and Gary, both visibly shaken, stood off to the side now, their eyes shifting nervously between Michael and the approaching sirens. The look on Rick's face was one of disbelief, as if he couldn't quite understand how everything had spiraled out of his control. But Sarah could see the cracks in his bravado now. His earlier swagger was gone, replaced by the uncomfortable shuffle of a man who knew he had crossed a line and was about to face the consequences. Gary, on the other hand, looked lost, caught in the tide of events he hadn't expected, unsure of how to navigate the fallout. Neither of them had anticipated that this night would end in their arrest, but as Michael's eyes burned into them, they understood that there was no escape. Tommy, still holding onto his mother's hand, kept looking up at Michael, his small face filled with a mixture of confusion and awe. He didn't fully grasp what was happening, why they had been treated this way, or why his father was so angry. He had always known Michael as a calm, measured man, someone who kept his cool no matter the situation. To see his father standing there, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled with righteous fury, was unsettling for the young boy. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her son's young shoulders, and her heart broke for him. She wanted so badly to shield him from the harsh realities of the world, the unfairness, the cruelty, the betrayal, but she knew that this was a lesson he would never forget. The world was a complicated place, and sometimes, the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones who hurt you the most. The sound of the sirens grew louder as the backup arrived. 2 more squad cars pulled into the parking lot, their flashing lights illuminating the darkness around them. Officers in uniform stepped out, their eyes quickly assessing the situation. Michael turned to face them, his voice steady but commanding as he briefed them on the situation. The officers nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. They had been trained to uphold the law, to protect and serve, but even they understood that there were times when those very principles had to be challenged. They couldn't just look the other way because of old friendships or professional loyalty. They couldn't let this slide. As the backup officers moved in to take Rick and Gary into custody, Sarah's mind wandered to the consequences of all of this. What would happen to Michael? Would he be seen as a hero, as the man who had done what was right in the face of overwhelming pressure? Or would he be seen as a traitor, someone who had turned his back on his fellow officers? The idea of her husband being branded as a pariah within the police department was something Sarah couldn't fully process. But even as the fear gnawed at her, she knew one thing for sure: Michael had done what needed to be done. He had chosen his family, chosen justice, and in doing so, he had chosen to do what was right. The officers, now leading Rick and Gary away in handcuffs, were met with an eerie silence. The crowd that had gathered earlier had all but disappeared, but the quiet lingered in the air, heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Sarah watched as her husband gave one last, pointed look at the 2 officers, his eyes telling them everything they needed to know. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about what they represented, about the promise of accountability and fairness in a system that was far from perfect. As the officers drove away, Rick and Gary in the back of their squad cars, Sarah's heart finally began to slow. The initial shock was fading, replaced by a mixture of exhaustion and relief. This chapter of their lives wasn't over, not by a long shot. But in that moment, as Michael turned to face her, as Tommy clung to her side, Sarah realized something. They had just witnessed the unraveling of something much larger than a simple family dispute. This was about power, about justice, and about the lengths one man would go to protect the ones he loved. "Mom?" Tommy asked quietly, his small voice pulling Sarah back into the moment. She looked down at him, her heart aching at the confusion still etched on his face. "Yeah, honey," she replied softly, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "What happens now?" he asked, his innocent eyes searching hers for answers. Sarah paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. What did happen now? There were so many unknowns, so many variables that couldn't be predicted. But one thing was clear: this moment, this night, would change their lives forever. Michael had made the choice to stand up, to do what was right even when it cost him everything. And for that, Sarah was proud of him. But the consequences would ripple through their lives, through their town, in ways they couldn't yet imagine. "We face it together," Sarah said finally, squeezing Tommy's hand. "Whatever happens, we face it together." As they walked toward the car, Michael placed a protective arm around both of them, a silent promise that he would never let anything happen to his family. And as the night stretched on, they didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The world had just shifted beneath their feet, and the ripple effects would be felt far and wide. The next few days were a whirlwind. The fallout from the incident at the park spread through Ridgewood faster than anyone had expected. What had started as a seemingly isolated altercation between two officers and a family quickly became the talk of the town. Whispers filled the local diners, the gas stations, the coffee shops. Everywhere people gathered, they were talking about Michael, about Rick and Gary, about what had happened that night and what it meant for their small, tight-knit community. Sarah could feel the shift in the air as they walked through the streets, people's eyes on her and Tommy, their murmurs barely masked by polite smiles. Some offered support, others offered judgment, but no one could look at them the same way again. For Michael, the repercussions were far more serious. As the days passed, he found himself pulled into meetings, summoned by higher-ups in the police department. His colleagues, the ones who had once been his allies, now looked at him with a mixture of suspicion and disappointment. A few of them had even tried to convince him that what had happened was an isolated incident, that it had been blown out of proportion. They didn't see it the way he did, didn't understand the moral line that had been crossed. In their eyes, Rick and Gary were just two officers who had made a mistake. But to Michael, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal of everything the badge stood for, everything he had worked for. And he couldn't let that go. The department launched an internal investigation into the events of that night. Michael was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. For Sarah, it was a nightmare she had never imagined. The idea of Michael being put on the defensive, of his career hanging in the balance, gnawed at her day and night. She had seen her husband stand tall in the face of so many challenges, but this was different. This wasn't a case of a criminal trying to escape justice. It was a case of the very system that was supposed to uphold the law, failing to do so. And now, Michael was being questioned for doing what was right. As Michael spent long hours meeting with investigators, Sarah found herself shouldering the emotional burden of the situation. Tommy had questions she didn't have answers to. "Why did the cops do that, Mom?" he asked one night after dinner, his innocent eyes searching hers for a reason that simply didn't exist. "Why would they hurt me like that?" Sarah had no good answer. She could tell him that not everyone in the world was kind, that sometimes people made mistakes, but she knew that wouldn't be enough. It wasn't just about understanding why Rick and Gary had done what they had, it was about understanding the pain they had caused, the irreparable damage done to their family's sense of safety. How could she explain to Tommy that not everyone who wore a badge could be trusted? How could she explain that, despite all the good cops out there, some of them were capable of cruelty? She could see the confusion in his face, the distrust beginning to take root in his young mind. One evening, after Michael had returned home late from another meeting, Sarah found him sitting on the couch, his face buried in his hands. He was exhausted, physically, emotionally, spiritually. She could see the toll it was taking on him. His strong demeanor had faltered in the wake of this scandal, his usual calm replaced by a sense of frustration that he couldn't shake. The weight of everything that had happened was crushing him. She sat beside him, gently placing her hand on his, her fingers tracing the lines of his palm. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how we got here. I never wanted this to happen. But I couldn't just stand by." "I know you couldn't," Sarah replied softly, squeezing his hand. "But I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose everything because of this." Michael nodded, his eyes filled with guilt and uncertainty. I don't know what will happen, Sarah. I don't know if they'll let me keep my job. If they'll even let me stay in Ridgewood. Everything is changing so fast. You did the right thing, she said, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. You stood up for us. For what's right. And if they can't see that, then maybe this town isn't where we need to be anymore. Michael looked at her, his eyes searching hers for reassurance. But what about Tommy? What about his future? Sarah smiled gently. His future will be whatever we make of it. If we stand together, if we keep our heads high, we'll get through this. And maybe, just maybe, this town will see that it's time for a change. The days that followed were a blur of investigations, media attention, and tension in the air. Ridgewood's community wasn't sure how to react. Some rallied behind Michael, hailing him as a hero for his courage in the face of corruption. Others saw him as a troublemaker, a man who had overstepped his bounds, risking everything for the sake of justice. The internal investigation went on for weeks, and the uncertainty weighed heavily on Michael and Sarah. Every phone call, every knock at the door, made their hearts skip a beat. Would the department back Michael, or would they cast him aside, just another casualty of an unfortunate situation? Then, just as the investigation seemed to be reaching a breaking point, something unexpected happened. Rick and Gary, once the prime suspects, were arrested on charges of misconduct, alcohol abuse while on duty, and child endangerment. Evidence had surfaced, testimonies, video footage from the park, and a thorough investigation into their behavior, that made it clear their actions were more than a one-time lapse of judgment. It broke Sarah's heart every time. She wanted to shield him from the cruelty of the world, but she knew she couldn't. She could only help him understand that his family wasn't the problem, that they had stood up for what was right. But the world wasn't always fair, and sometimes, the truth didn't always make things easier. She made sure to spend time with him, to listen to his frustrations, to remind him of the strength he had inside. It wasn't much, but it helped. Slowly, over time, Tommy began to find his footing again. His classmates started to realize the truth, that his family wasn't in the wrong. The jokes and whispers faded, replaced by respect, and as time went on, his reputation at school grew stronger. It was an unexpected form of redemption, but it was one that Michael and Sarah knew would stick with their son forever. Meanwhile, the police department, under increasing pressure, began to make changes. The internal investigation into Rick and Gary had led to their arrests, but it also revealed larger issues within the force, issues that couldn't be ignored any longer. Michael had heard rumblings of reform, of new leadership being brought in to rebuild the tarnished reputation of the department. While it didn't make everything right, it was a step in the right direction. There were talks of new policies on accountability, new systems to ensure that officers could no longer act with impunity. Michael didn't know if these changes would stick, if they would truly be effective. He had seen too much, been let down too many times to fully trust that the system would change on its own. But he also knew that without people like him, people willing to challenge the status quo, things would never get better. And he had learned, more than ever, that sometimes doing the right thing meant taking risks, knowing that you might lose everything but gaining something much more valuable in the end. The town of Ridgewood, though scarred, was beginning to heal. The once quiet streets, which had been so hesitant to speak up, were now buzzing with conversations about the future. People were talking about what needed to change, about how they could rebuild trust, not just with the police, but with each other. Sarah had always known that Ridgewood was full of good people. The incident had brought out the worst in some, but it had also brought out the best in others. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now reached out to offer support. There were town meetings where people openly discussed the issues they had long ignored. It wasn't easy, and there were still some who resisted the changes, who clung to the old ways. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like the community was coming together, not just to repair what had been broken, but to create something better. For Michael, there was a new sense of purpose. His future in law enforcement was uncertain, but he was no longer worried about what might happen to him. His role in the department had changed. Perhaps irrevocably, but his integrity was intact. And as he sat at the kitchen table one evening, with Sarah and Tommy beside him, he realized that no matter what came next, he had done the right thing. They had made it through the storm together. Their family had endured what most people couldn't imagine, but they had emerged stronger for it. "Mom," Tommy said one night, as he finished his homework, his eyes bright with the innocence of childhood, "when I grow up, I want to be just like Dad." The words made Sarah's heart swell with pride. Michael turned to his son, his voice full of tenderness. "You don't have to be like me, buddy," he said, ruffling Tommy's hair. "Just be yourself. That's all anyone can ask for." It was a simple statement, but one that carried so much weight. Michael had learned, through everything they had been through, that doing what was right wasn't always the easiest path. It wasn't about accolades or recognition, it was about standing up for what you believed in, no matter the consequences. And in that moment, as he looked at Sarah and Tommy, he realized that the most important thing wasn't the job he had, or the title he held, it was the love and respect of the family that had stood by him every step of the way. They didn't know what the future held. But together, as a family, they were ready to face whatever came next. They had weathered the storm, and now, with their heads held high, they knew they could rebuild, not just their lives, but their town, their community, and their future. The lessons of that night, of the strength it took to make hard decisions, would stay with them forever. And as they walked through the streets of Ridgewood, side by side, they knew that no matter what came next, they would always have each other. The story of that night would fade into the past, but its impact would be felt for generations to come. The courage, the sacrifice, and the unwavering love of a family would never be forgotten.